Bankrupt millionaire gives his house keys to a homeless mother with a crying baby in the rain, even though he had almost nothing. The rain fell like bullets against the cracked pavement of Fifth Avenue, each drop exploding into 1,000 smaller pieces that scattered across the sidewalk like shattered dreams. Daniel Kessler sat motionless in his SUV, the last symbol of his former life that the bank hadn't yet repossessed, watching the world blur behind sheets of water cascading down his windshield. 3 months ago, he'd been on the cover of Forbes, the tech visionary who revolutionized baby safety. The headline had proclaimed, featuring a photo of him in his corner office, 42nd floor, overlooking the city that had once bowed to his innovation. Daniel Kessler, CEO of Secure Tech Solutions, the man who'd turned a simple idea about baby monitoring into a $100 million empire. Now, those same magazines ran different headlines. Kessler's catastrophic fall, how a product recall bankrupted a tech giant. The rise and fall of Daniel Kessler, a modern-day Icarus. The words still burned in his chest like acid, but not as much as the silence from his phone. No calls from investors, no texts from friends, no emails from the woman who'd promised to love him for richer or poorer before disappearing the moment his accounts were frozen. The rain hammered harder, and through the storm, Daniel heard something that made his blood run cold. A baby's cry, desperate and piercing, cutting through the noise of the storm like a knife through his heart. He leaned forward, squinting through the passenger window. Across the street, huddled beneath the narrow overhang of a closed boutique, sat a young woman. She couldn't have been more than 25, her dark hair plastered to her skull, her clothes soaked through and clinging to her thin frame. In her arms, wrapped in what looked like an old gray hoodie, was an infant, the source of those heart-wrenching cries. The woman rocked back and forth, her lips moving in what Daniel realized were whispered words of comfort, though they seemed to do nothing to calm the baby. At her feet sat a single plastic bag, transparent enough that Daniel could see diapers and what might have been a bottle inside. No stroller, no umbrella, no husband or boyfriend hovering protectively nearby. Just a mother and her child, abandoned to the storm. Daniel's chest tightened. He'd seen homeless people before. Of course, Manhattan was full of them. But something about this scene felt different. Personal. The way she held that baby, the fierce protectiveness in her posture despite her obvious desperation, reminded him of something he'd buried deep in his memory. His phone buzzed. A text from his lawyer. Bank wants car keys by Friday. Sorry, Dan. I'll keep fighting, but prepare for the worst. Daniel stared at the message, then at the woman across the street. The baby's cries seemed to be getting weaker, more desperate. How long had they been out there? How long could a baby survive in weather like this? He thought about his penthouse apartment, or what used to be his penthouse apartment. The eviction notice had come yesterday, taped to his door like a scarlet letter. He had until the end of the week to get out. After that, he'd be just like her, homeless, desperate, with nowhere to go. But she had a baby. Daniel's hand moved to the door handle before his mind could stop him. The rain hit him like a physical blow the moment he stepped outside, soaking through his expensive suit jacket within seconds. But he didn't care. He crossed the street in long strides, his Italian leather shoes splashing through puddles that would have horrified him just months ago. The woman looked up as he approached, her eyes wide with fear. They were green, he noticed, and filled with a mixture of shame and desperation that made his stomach clench. She pulled the baby closer to her chest, as if expecting him to hurt them. Please, she said, her voice barely audible over the rain. We're not bothering anyone. We'll move if you want us to move. Daniel stopped in his tracks. She thought he was there to make them leave. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. When had he become the kind of man people automatically feared? When had his presence started representing authority and judgment instead of help? No, he said quickly, raising his hands. No, I'm not. I'm not here to make you move. The baby's cries intensified, and the woman's face crumpled. I don't know what's wrong, she whispered, her voice breaking. He won't stop crying. I think he's hungry, but the formula. She gestured helplessly at the plastic bag. It got wet. Everything got wet. Daniel felt something crack inside his chest. Without thinking, he shrugged out of his suit jacket, a $3,000 Tom Ford piece that had been tailored to perfection, and held it out to her. Here, he said, you'll catch pneumonia. She stared at the jacket as if it were a snake. I can't. I don't have money to pay you back if something happens to it. I don't want money, Daniel said, and realized he meant it. Please, just take it. Slowly, carefully, she reached out and took the jacket. It was huge on her small frame, but she wrapped it around herself and the baby, and for a moment, the infant's cries softened. Thank you, she whispered, and Daniel saw tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks. He crouched down beside her, his expensive pants soaking up water from the concrete. What's your name? Sarah, she said quietly. Sarah Martinez. And this is Mateo. I'm Daniel, he said. How long have you been out here? Sarah's jaw tightened. 3 days. Maybe 4. I lost track. Where are you staying? She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Wherever we can. Shelters are full. Been on the waiting list for weeks. Daniel felt his heart hammering against his ribs. 3 days in the rain with a baby. How is that even possible? How is any of this possible in a city where people paid $30 for a single cocktail? Sarah, he said carefully, do you have any family? Anyone who could help? Her face hardened. If I had family who could help, do you think I'd be sitting here? The words came out sharper than she'd probably intended, and Daniel saw her flinch immediately after. I'm sorry, she said quickly. I didn't mean to. You're being kind, and You're being a mother protecting her child, Daniel said firmly. Don't apologize for that. Sarah studied his face, and Daniel wondered what she saw there. A businessman in a ruined suit? A stranger with unknown motives? Or something else entirely? Why are you helping me? She asked quietly. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, watching the rain create rivers in the gutters. I don't know, he said finally, which was both true and completely inadequate. But the real answer was buried deeper, in a memory he'd spent 35 years trying to forget. A memory of his own mother, 23 years old with a screaming toddler in a bus station in Cleveland, with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. A memory of a stranger, a woman in a red coat, who'd sat down beside them and offered help without asking questions. That woman had changed their lives. She'd given them a phone number, an address, a chance. Without her, Daniel might never have made it out of that bus station. He might never have had the chance to build an empire, even if that empire had ultimately crumbled. Listen, he said, the words coming out before he could stop them. I have a place. It's not much anymore, but it's warm. It's dry. You and Mateo could stay there tonight. Sarah's eyes widened in alarm. No, she said quickly. No, I can't. I don't even know you. You're right, Daniel said. You shouldn't trust me. But Sarah, look at me. He waited until she met his eyes. I'm not going to hurt you. I swear on my mother's grave. I'm not going to hurt you or your baby. Something in his voice must have convinced her, because her grip on Mateo loosened slightly. Why would you do that? Let strangers stay in your house. Daniel thought about the eviction notice in his pocket, about the empty bank accounts and the friends who'd stopped returning his calls. Because, he said slowly, I think we might have more in common than you'd expect. The baby's cries had quieted to whimpers, exhausted sobs that somehow sounded even worse than the screaming. Daniel felt time running out, felt the window of opportunity closing. If he didn't act now, he'd lose his nerve. He'd walk away, go back to his car, and pretend this conversation had never happened. My car's across the street, he said. 5 minutes. Let me drive you somewhere warm, somewhere safe. If you don't like it, if anything feels wrong, I'll bring you right back here. I promise. Sarah looked down at her baby, at his tiny face red with crying and cold, at his lips that were starting to look blue around the edges. Daniel held his breath. Okay, she whispered finally. Okay, but just for tonight. Daniel felt something ease in his chest, a tension he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. Just for tonight, he agreed, though something deep inside him suspected this was going to be much more complicated than one night. As he helped Sarah to her feet, as he gathered her meager belongings and guided her across the street to his car, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing at a crossroads. That this moment, this decision, was going to change everything. He just had no idea how much. The drive across town happened in relative silence, broken only by the steady rhythm of windshield wipers and Mateo's occasional whimpers. Sarah sat pressed against the passenger door, as far from Daniel as possible, her arms wrapped protectively around her baby. Daniel couldn't blame her for being cautious. He was, after all, a complete stranger who'd just convinced a homeless woman to get in his car. The irony wasn't lost on him. 6 months ago, he'd been the kind of man people recognized on the street, the kind of man whose opinion mattered in boardrooms across the city. Now, he was the kind of man a desperate mother was afraid to trust. "This is it," Daniel said as he pulled into the driveway of a modest two-story house in Queens. It was nothing like his former penthouse. No doorman, no marble lobby, no floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. Just a simple house with a small front yard and a mortgage that was 3 months behind. Sarah stared at the house through the passenger window. "This is yours." "Was mine," Daniel said quietly. "The bank." "Well, let's just say my ownership is temporary." He led her up the front walk, fumbling with keys that felt heavier than they should have. The front door stuck. It had been doing that since the heating system failed and the humidity got out of control, but Daniel managed to force it open. The interior of the house was a study in emptiness. The hardwood floors were scuffed and bare, marked with rectangular shadows where furniture used to sit. The walls were lined with darker patches where artwork had once hung. A few boxes sat stacked in the corner of the living room, the remnants of a life that had been systematically dismantled. "The furniture," Sarah said quietly. "What happened to it?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "Seized. Sold. Gone." He gestured around the empty space. "I got to keep some basics. There's a mattress upstairs, a few dishes in the kitchen. Not much, but it's warm." He watched Sarah take in the devastation, saw her eyes move from the empty rooms to the water stains on the ceiling where a pipe had burst and he hadn't had the money to fix it properly. This was his life now, the ruins of everything he'd built. "You were rich," Sarah said. "It wasn't a question." "I was," Daniel admitted. "Very rich. And very stupid." Sarah shifted Mateo in her arms, and Daniel noticed the baby had stopped crying. The warmth of the house, perhaps, or simply exhaustion. "What happened?" Daniel walked to the window overlooking the backyard, where an expensive outdoor furniture set still sat covered in tarps. Apparently, the bank's repo men hadn't gotten around to the patio yet. "I built a company. Secure Tech Solutions. We made smart baby monitors, car seat sensors, crib safety systems. The works." "That sounds good. Important." "It was. Or I thought it was." Daniel's reflection in the window looked like a ghost, pale, hollow-eyed, haunted. "We had this product, the Infant Guard 3000. Revolutionary, we called it. A comprehensive monitoring system that tracked everything: breathing, heart rate, temperature, sleep patterns. Parents loved it. Hospitals endorsed it. We couldn't keep up with demand." Sarah settled onto the floor, leaning against the wall with Mateo cradled in her arms. The baby's eyes were closed now, his breathing steady and peaceful. But something went wrong. Something went catastrophically wrong. Daniel turned away from the window. The sensors had a flaw, a tiny glitch in the software that caused them to give false readings. Most of the time, it was harmless, showed a baby was awake when they were sleeping, that kind of thing. But sometimes, he couldn't finish the sentence. Even now, 3 months later, the words stuck in his throat like broken glass. "Sometimes what?" Sarah asked gently. Daniel closed his eyes. "Sometimes they failed when it mattered most. 3 babies died because their parents trusted our monitors. 3 families lost everything because I was too arrogant to properly test the software before we rushed it to market." The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel waited for Sarah to recoil, to grab her baby and run. He waited for the accusation, the horror, the judgment he'd seen in so many faces over the past few months. Instead, Sarah said quietly, "I'm sorry." Daniel's eyes snapped open. "You're sorry? I just told you I'm responsible for." "You're responsible for trying to save babies," Sarah interrupted. "For caring enough to invent something that could help. The fact that it didn't work perfectly doesn't make you a monster. Tell that to the families who lost their children. I'm sure you've told yourself that 1,000 times already." Sarah adjusted Mateo's position, and Daniel noticed her movements were becoming more relaxed, less guarded. "What happened to your company?" "Lawsuits. Criminal investigations. Every investor pulled out overnight. The bank froze all my accounts pending the legal settlements." Daniel slumped against the wall, suddenly exhausted. "I lost everything in 6 weeks. The penthouse, the cars, the company, the woman I thought I was going to marry. Everything." "The woman you thought you were going to marry?" Daniel laughed bitterly. "Victoria. We were together for 2 years. She said she loved me for who I was, not what I had. Turns out who I was apparently just a rich guy with a nice apartment." Sarah was quiet for a moment, studying his face. She left when the money ran out? She left before the money ran out. The moment the first lawsuit was filed, she was gone. Didn't even leave a note. Just gone. I'm sorry, Sarah said again. And this time Daniel heard something different in her voice. Recognition, maybe. Understanding. What about you? Daniel asked. How did you end up? He gestured vaguely toward the door, toward the storm outside. Sarah's face hardened slightly. That's a long story. We've got time. She was quiet for so long that Daniel thought she wasn't going to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I was a nursing student, she said. 2 years into my program at Hunter College. I had a job at a medical clinic, a small apartment in the Bronx, a plan. Everything was not perfect, but okay. And then I met Marcus. Daniel noticed the way her arms tightened around Mateo as she said the name. Marcus was older, charming, successful, or so he said. He swept me off my feet with expensive dinners and weekend trips and promises about our future together. I got pregnant 4 months after we met. And he wasn't happy about it. Sarah's laugh was sharp and bitter. Oh, he was thrilled. Couldn't wait to be a father. Insisted I move in with him. Said he'd take care of everything. I dropped out of school, quit my job, became completely dependent on him. Which, I realize now, was exactly what he wanted. Daniel felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach. He'd heard stories like this before, but somehow, sitting in his empty house with this woman and her baby, it felt more real than it ever had. The first time he hit me, I was 7 months pregnant, Sarah continued, her voice steady but her hands shaking slightly. He said it was my fault, that I'd been disrespectful, that he was under a lot of stress. I believed him, or I wanted to believe him. Sarah, it got worse after Mateo was born. Marcus said the baby was too loud, that I wasn't controlling him properly. He started drinking more, staying out later. And when he came home, she trailed off, but Daniel could fill in the blanks. You left him. I tried to leave him. Twice. Both times, he found me. The second time, Sarah pulled up the sleeve of her shirt, revealing a faded bruise that wrapped around her forearm like a bracelet. He said if I ever tried to leave again, he'd kill us both. And I believed him. Daniel felt something cold and sharp settle in his chest. How did you get away? I didn't. He threw us out. Sarah's voice cracked slightly. 3 weeks ago, he came home drunk and angry about something at work. Started screaming about how we were ruining his life, how he never wanted a baby, how I'd trapped him. I tried to calm him down, but he just snapped. Told me to get the hell out and never come back. Just like that. Just like that. I grabbed what I could carry and left. Been on the streets ever since. Daniel stared at this woman. This girl, really, who couldn't be more than 25, and felt something shift inside him. His problems, his lost fortune, his ruined reputation. Suddenly, they seemed small compared to what Sarah had endured. Have you tried going back? Sarah shook her head. I drove by the apartment last week. There's a new lock on the door and another woman's clothes on the balcony. He's already moved on. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the rain patter against the windows and Mateo's soft breathing. The house felt different with them in it, Daniel realized. Less empty, less haunted. Sarah, he said finally, you can stay here as long as you need to. She looked up sharply. No, I told you just for tonight. The bank isn't taking the house until next week. Maybe longer if my lawyer can file the right papers. You and Mateo need somewhere safe, somewhere warm. I can't just. Yes, you can. Daniel's voice was firmer than he'd intended. Look, I'm going to lose this place anyway. At least if you're here, it's helping someone instead of just sitting empty. Sarah studied his face, and Daniel wondered what she was looking for. Evidence of ulterior motives? Signs that he was too good to be true? Why? She asked finally. Why are you doing this? Daniel considered the question seriously. Why was he doing this? It would have been easier to drive past, to pretend he hadn't seen her. It would have been safer to keep his distance, to focus on his own problems. Because, he said slowly, 30 years ago, my mother and I were in a bus station in Cleveland with nowhere to go and no money for a ticket. I was 3 years old, and I was crying, and she was at the end of her rope. A stranger helped us. A woman in a red coat who gave my mother money for a bus ticket and the address of a shelter in New York. If she hadn't done that, you might not be here. I definitely wouldn't be here. And neither would you, probably. That shelter was where my mother met my stepfather. He adopted me, put me through school, Gave me opportunities one never would have had otherwise. Sarah was quiet, absorbing this information. So this is paying it forward. Maybe. Or maybe I'm just tired of being alone in this house, waiting for the bank to come take the keys. As if summoned by his words, Daniel's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it and felt his heart sink. Bank wants to move up the timeline, he said quietly. House has to be vacated by Friday. Today was Tuesday. Sarah's face fell. I'm sorry. I know you said I could stay, but we'll figure something out, Daniel said, though he had no idea what. We've got 3 days. Maybe 4 if we're lucky. As he said it, Daniel realized he'd said we. Not, you'll figure something out, or I'll figure something out. We. When had that happened? When had this become a joint problem? But as he looked at Sarah and Mateo, at this young mother who'd been through hell and was still fighting to keep her babies safe, Daniel realized he didn't want to face the next few days alone. And maybe, just maybe, they could help each other figure out what came next. Daniel woke up on Wednesday morning to the smell of coffee and something else, something warm and comforting that he couldn't immediately identify. For a moment, he forgot where he was, forgot about the empty house and the eviction notice and the woman and baby he'd brought home in the storm. Then he heard voices from downstairs, Sarah's voice, soft and musical, talking to Mateo in the way mothers do, with complete attention and infinite patience. He'd slept on the couch, giving Sarah and the baby his bedroom and the only remaining mattress in the house. His back ached from the uncomfortable sleeping arrangements, but it was a small price to pay for the first full night's sleep he'd had in weeks. Daniel made his way downstairs, following the smell of coffee and the sound of Sarah's voice. He found her in the kitchen, moving around with surprising familiarity considering she'd only been there one night. She was wearing one of his old t-shirts, a faded MIT logo that had once been black but was now charcoal gray, and a pair of sweatpants that were comically too large for her small frame. "Good morning," she said, glancing up from the stove where she was scrambling eggs. "I hope you don't mind. I found some eggs in the fridge and, well, I couldn't sleep, so I thought I might as well make breakfast." Daniel stared at the scene in front of him. The kitchen, which had felt sterile and abandoned for months, was somehow transformed. Sarah had found a dish towel and draped it over the handle of the stove. She'd arranged some wilted flowers from the backyard in a glass, not a vase, just a regular drinking glass, and placed them on the counter. Mateo was sleeping peacefully in a makeshift bassinet she'd created using a laundry basket and some towels. It looked like a home. For the first time in months, Daniel's house looked like a place where people actually lived. "This is," he started, then stopped, not sure how to finish the sentence. "I know it's presumptuous," Sarah said quickly, misinterpreting his silence. "I should have asked first. I just thought." "No," Daniel interrupted. "It's perfect. It's been months since anyone cooked in this kitchen." Sarah smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes and transformed her entire face. "I like cooking. It makes me feel normal, like everything might be okay." She handed him a cup of coffee, and Daniel was surprised to find it was exactly how he liked it. Strong, no sugar, just a splash of milk. "How did you know?" "Lucky guess," Sarah said, but there was something in her expression that suggested it was more than that. "You look like a black coffee kind of guy." They ate breakfast in comfortable silence, sitting on the floor of the living room since there was no furniture left. Mateo had woken up and was lying on a blanket between them, staring up at the ceiling with the serious expression that babies sometimes get, as if they're contemplating the mysteries of the universe. "He's beautiful," Daniel said, watching the baby's tiny fingers grasp at the air. "He looks like his father," Sarah said quietly, and Daniel heard the complicated mix of love and pain in her voice. "That's not necessarily a bad thing." "No," Sarah agreed. "Marcus wasn't always what he became. When I first met him, he was different. Charming. Funny. I think maybe if things had been different, if he'd gotten help." She trailed off, but Daniel understood. It was the same way he sometimes thought about Victoria, wondering if she would have stayed if he'd handled the crisis differently, if he'd been stronger or smarter or more prepared. "Do you miss him?" Daniel asked. Sarah considered the question seriously. "I miss who I thought he was. I miss the man I fell in love with. But that man, I don't think he ever really existed." Daniel nodded. "I understand that. Do you miss her?" "Victoria? I miss having someone," Daniel said honestly. "I miss not being alone. But Victoria, I think maybe you're right. The woman I thought I loved might not have ever really existed either. Mateo chose that moment to start fussing, and Sarah immediately scooped him up, checking his diaper and offering him a bottle. Daniel watched her move with practiced efficiency, every gesture economical and purposeful. "You're a natural," he said. "I had to learn fast," Sarah replied. Marcus wasn't. He wasn't much help with the baby stuff. Daniel felt that familiar flash of anger toward a man he'd never met. "You shouldn't have had to do it alone." "No," Sarah agreed. "But I did, and now I know I can handle it." There was strength in her voice, a quiet confidence that Daniel admired. This woman had been through hell, but she hadn't broken. She'd adapted, survived, found ways to keep going. "Sarah," he said carefully, "can I ask you something?" She nodded, settling back onto the floor with Mateo cradled in her arms. "Yesterday, when I told you about my company, about the baby monitors that failed, you said I was trying to save babies. But the thing is, I never really thought about it that way. To me, it was just business, a market opportunity. Parents were anxious about their baby's safety, so we gave them technology to ease that anxiety." "But that's the same thing, isn't it?" Sarah asked. "Helping anxious parents is helping babies." "Maybe, but I think I lost sight of that somewhere along the way. It became about profit margins and market share and beating the competition. The actual babies, the actual families, they became abstract. Numbers on a spreadsheet." Sarah was quiet for a moment, adjusting Mateo's position. "What would you do differently if you could go back?" Daniel had asked himself that question 1,000 times over the past 3 months. More testing, better quality control, slower rollout. Everything my engineers told me to do that I ignored because I was in a hurry to get to market first. "That's not what I meant," Sarah said softly. Daniel looked at her, confused. "I mean, what would you do differently about the focus? About remembering that the numbers on the spreadsheet are real babies, real families?" The question hit Daniel like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on the technical failures, the business mistakes, the things he could have done better from a corporate perspective. But Sarah was asking about something deeper, about the fundamental purpose of what he'd been trying to accomplish. "I don't know," he admitted. "I do," Sarah said quietly. "You'd talk to more parents. Real parents, not focus groups or market research. You'd spend time with babies, with families. You'd make sure every decision was made with a real face in mind, not just market data." Daniel stared at her. "How do you know that?" Sarah smiled, a little sadly. "Because that's what you're doing now. With us. You're not seeing us as a charity case or a tax write-off or a way to feel better about yourself. You're seeing us as people, as individuals who matter." Before Daniel could respond, his phone rang. The caller ID showed his lawyer's number, and Daniel's stomach immediately clenched. "I have to take this," he said, stepping into the kitchen. "Daniel," his lawyer's voice was tense. "We've got a problem. The bank moved the eviction up again. You have until tomorrow at 5 p.m. Daniel closed his eyes. "Tomorrow? But you said Friday." "I know what I said, but they're not playing games anymore. They want the house empty and the keys turned in by tomorrow evening, or they're sending the sheriff." "Can't you file something? An extension, an appeal, anything?" "I filed everything I can file." "Dan, I'm sorry, but this is the end of the line. You need to be out by tomorrow." Daniel hung up the phone and stood in the kitchen, staring at the wilted flowers Sarah had arranged in the drinking glass. "Tomorrow. Less than 24 hours. Bad news." Sarah's voice came from behind him. Daniel turned around. She was standing in the doorway, Mateo still in her arms, and her face was carefully neutral. But he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she was holding herself ready to run. "The eviction got moved up," Daniel said quietly. "We have to be out by tomorrow at 5 p.m. Sarah nodded slowly. "Okay, I'll pack up our things." "Sarah, wait." "No, it's okay," she said quickly. "You've been more than generous. We'll figure something out." "Where will you go?" The question hung in the air between them. Daniel saw Sarah's facade crack slightly, saw the fear creep back into her eyes. "The shelter waiting list," she said finally. "Maybe something opened up. Or there's a women's center in Brooklyn that sometimes has emergency beds." Daniel felt something snap inside his chest. "No. No. I mean, yes, we'll look into those options. But I'm not just going to send you back out on the street. We'll figure this out together. Daniel, you can't save us. You need to focus on yourself, on getting your own life back together." "Maybe," Daniel said. But maybe I can't get my life back together without helping you get yours together first. Sarah stared at him, and Daniel saw something shift in her expression. Surprise, maybe, or something deeper. What do you mean? Daniel wasn't sure what he meant exactly. The words had come out before he'd really thought about them. But as he stood there in his empty kitchen, looking at this woman who'd brought warmth and life back into his house, he realized there was truth in what he'd said. I mean, he said slowly, that for the first time in months, I feel like I have a purpose. Like I'm doing something that matters. And I think maybe that's what I've been missing. Taking care of us isn't your purpose, Daniel. We're not your responsibility. No, Daniel agreed. But maybe you're my opportunity. Opportunity for what? Daniel thought about what Sarah had said earlier, about talking to real parents and keeping real faces in mind. About the difference between seeing people as statistics and seeing them as individuals who mattered. To remember what I was supposed to be doing in the first place, he said. To remember that the point was never the technology or the profits or the magazine covers. The point was supposed to be helping people. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying his face. And you think helping us will help you remember that? I think, Daniel said carefully, that maybe we can help each other remember who we're supposed to be. Outside, the rain had stopped, and weak sunlight was filtering through the kitchen window. Daniel could hear birds singing in the backyard, the first birds he'd noticed in months. So what do we do? Sarah asked finally. Daniel looked around the kitchen, at the makeshift home Sarah had created in less than 24 hours, at the baby who was gurgling contentedly in her arms, at the woman who'd somehow made him feel less alone than he'd felt in months. I don't know, he said honestly, but we've got 24 hours to figure it out. As if responding to his words, Mateo let out a small laugh, his first laugh that Daniel had heard, and the sound filled the empty kitchen with something that felt remarkably like hope. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of phone calls, packing, and increasingly desperate searches for housing options. Daniel spent the morning calling every contact he still had, every favor he could think to cash in, but the responses were uniformly disappointing. The few people who returned his calls at all offered sympathy, but no concrete help. Sarah had better luck with the social services organizations, but not much better. The women's shelter in Brooklyn had a waiting list 6 weeks long. The emergency housing program had run out of funding for the month. The Family Services Center could offer them vouchers for a motel for 3 nights, but after that, they'd be on their own again. By 3 p.m., with 2 hours left before the eviction deadline, Daniel found himself sitting on the floor of his empty living room, surrounded by the few possessions he had left, feeling more helpless than he'd felt in months. Sarah was in the kitchen, feeding Mateo and making her own phone calls. Daniel could hear her voice through the thin walls, patient and polite even as she was turned down again and again. Thank you anyway, she was saying. Yes, I understand. If anything opens up, please call me. Daniel heard her hang up and sigh heavily. A moment later, she appeared in the doorway, Mateo balanced on her hip. Any luck? He asked, though her expression had already given him the answer. The motel vouchers, she said quietly. 3 nights. After that, she shrugged, but Daniel could see the fear she was trying to hide. I'm sorry, Daniel said. I thought I could fix this. I thought I could. You've done more than anyone else has, Sarah interrupted. More than you had any reason to do. Daniel's phone buzzed with another text from his lawyer. Sheriff will be there at 5. Keys need to be on the kitchen counter. I'm sorry, Dan. We should start loading my car, Daniel said, standing up. Get you and Mateo to that motel before. Daniel, Sarah said suddenly. Can I see it? See what? The baby monitor. The one that failed. Do you have one here? Daniel frowned. Why would you want to see that? I don't know. Maybe I'm curious. Maybe I want to understand what happened. Daniel hesitated. He'd thrown away most of the secure tech products months ago, unable to stand the sight of them. But there was one Infant Guard 3000 unit left, buried in one of the boxes in the corner. He'd kept it, he told himself, as a reminder of his failures. But really, he'd kept it because throwing it away felt like giving up entirely. He found the box and pulled out the sleek white device, smaller than a smartphone but packed with sensors and processors that had once represented the cutting edge of baby safety technology. The irony of the name wasn't lost on him. Infant Guard, the device that had failed to guard the infants who needed it most. This is it, he said, handing it to Sarah. The monitor that destroyed my life. Sarah turned the device over in her hands. examining it with the same careful attention she gave to everything else. It's smaller than I expected. Miniaturization was one of our key selling points. Parents didn't want bulky equipment cluttering up the nursery, and it monitored breathing, heart rate, temperature, movement, sleep patterns. The idea was to give parents complete peace of mind. Daniel's voice was bitter. Some peace of mind. Sarah was still studying the device, running her fingers along its edges. How did it attach to the baby? Chest sensor, Daniel said, pulling a small adhesive pad from the box. Completely safe, hypoallergenic, designed to stay put but not be uncomfortable. And the readings went to an app? App, web portal, smart home integration. Parents could monitor their baby from anywhere. Daniel sat down heavily on one of the remaining boxes. The technology was revolutionary. The execution was catastrophic. Sarah placed the monitor on the floor and sat down across from Daniel, Mateo in her lap. Tell me about the malfunction. Exactly what went wrong. Daniel looked at her sharply. Why are you asking about this? Sarah, I know you're trying to help, but just tell me. Please. Something in her voice made Daniel take a closer look at her expression. She wasn't just being polite or trying to distract him from their housing crisis. She was genuinely interested, genuinely focused on the technical details in a way that seemed oddly professional. The sensors worked perfectly, Daniel said slowly. The problem was in the data processing. The algorithm that interpreted the sensor readings had a timing issue, a lag between when the sensor detected something and when the app displayed the information. How long of a lag? Usually just a few seconds. But sometimes, if the processor was handling multiple data streams or if there was interference from other devices, the lag could stretch to 30 seconds or more. Sarah nodded, still studying the device. And that's when babies died. Daniel winced. In 3 cases, yes. The monitors showed normal readings for babies who had actually stopped breathing by the time the parents realized something was wrong. He couldn't finish the sentence. Even now, months later, the guilt felt like a physical weight in his chest. But most of the time, it worked fine? Sarah asked. Most of the time, yes. That was part of what made it so hard to catch during testing. The malfunction was intermittent, unpredictable. We shipped hundreds of thousands of units, and 99.9% of them worked exactly as advertised. But 0.1% was too many. 0.1% was 3 babies too many. Sarah was quiet for a moment, still turning the monitor over in her hands. Then she said something that made Daniel's blood run cold. I had one of these. Daniel stared at her. What? Not this exact model, but the previous version. The Infant Guard 2500. I bought it when Mateo was born, used it for about 2 weeks. Sarah, it didn't work right, she continued, her voice steady but distant. The readings were always delayed. I'd watch Mateo breathing, but the app would show flat lines for 20 or 30 seconds before it caught up. I thought maybe I was using it wrong, so I called customer service. Daniel felt like the floor was dropping out from under him. What did they tell you? That it was normal. That there was sometimes a slight delay in data transmission, but that the sensors were working fine. They told me to trust the device, not my eyes. Oh God. Daniel put his head in his hands. Sarah, I'm so sorry. I didn't trust it, Sarah said firmly. Something felt wrong, so I returned it and got my money back. But Daniel, I talked to other mothers in my mom's group. Some of them had the same problem, but they kept using the monitors anyway because customer service told them it was normal. Daniel looked up at her, and the expression on her face was unlike anything he'd seen from her before. There was anger there, yes, but also something else, something that looked almost like excitement. The lag wasn't random, was it? She said. It happened under specific conditions. How do you? I'm not just a homeless mother, Daniel. I was a nursing student, remember? 2 years of training, including courses in medical technology and patient monitoring systems. I know how these devices are supposed to work. Daniel felt something shift in his understanding of who Sarah was, who she had been before Marcus and the abuse in the streets. You think you know what caused the malfunction? I think I know exactly what caused it. Sarah's voice was growing more confident, more animated. And I think I know how to fix it. Sarah, that's impossible. I had a team of 20 engineers working on this problem for months. If there was a simple fix, did any of your engineers have babies? Sarah asked. What? Did any of your 20 engineers have babies? Were any of them parents who had actually used the device in real-world conditions? Daniel thought about his engineering team, brilliant people, all of them, but young, mostly single, focused on the technical challenges rather than the practical applications. Most of them were no. They were mostly recent graduates, people in their 20s. People who understood the technology but not the reality of how it gets used by exhausted parents in the middle of the night. I still don't see how that. Daniel, the lag happened when the processor was handling multiple data streams, right? Or when there was interference from other devices. Yes. What other devices are typically running in a baby's room at 2 a.m. when parents are most worried about their sleeping infant? Daniel started to say nothing, then stopped. He thought about the nurseries he'd visited during product development, the ones that had been carefully staged for their marketing photos. But what about real nurseries, used by real parents in real situations? Night lights, he said slowly. Humidifiers, white noise machines, sometimes tablets or phones playing lullabies. Smart home devices, Sarah added. Baby cameras that stream to parents' phones. Alexa or Google Home units that parents use to set timers for feedings or play music. All running on the same wireless network, Daniel said, understanding beginning to dawn. All competing for bandwidth. And when do parents most desperately need the monitor to work perfectly? When they're already anxious, when they've been up all night, when they're running multiple devices to help soothe the baby. Daniel stared at her. You're saying the monitor failed precisely when parents needed it most. I'm saying the monitor was designed by people who understood the technology, but not the environment where it would be used. It was tested in labs with perfect conditions, not in real nurseries with real families dealing with real stress. Daniel felt something click in his mind, a piece of the puzzle he'd been missing for months. The bandwidth competition. We tested for individual device interference, but we never tested for multiple simultaneous connections in a typical home network environment. And you never asked parents what their nighttime routines actually looked like. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, processing this revelation. Sarah was right. His team had approached the problem from a purely technical standpoint, never considering the human factors that would affect performance. Sarah, he said carefully, if you're right about this, if the fix is as simple as better bandwidth management or network prioritization, then your company failed because you forgot to ask parents what they actually needed, Sarah finished. Not what they said they wanted in focus groups, but what they actually needed in their real lives with their real babies. Daniel's phone buzzed again. Another text from his lawyer, probably wondering where he was. The eviction deadline was less than 30 minutes away. But suddenly, Daniel didn't care about the deadline or the empty house, or even the boxes scattered around the living room. Show me, he said. What? Show me what you think the fix is. We've got 25 minutes before the sheriff gets here. Show me how to save the company that destroyed my life. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, then down at Mateo, who was sleeping peacefully in her arms, oblivious to the conversation that might change all their lives. Okay, she said, but we're going to need your laptop. Daniel's laptop was one of the few pieces of technology he'd managed to keep through the bankruptcy proceedings, partly because it was 3 years old and not worth much to creditors, and partly because his lawyer had argued that he needed it to search for jobs. Now, as Sarah bent over the keyboard with Mateo, sleeping in a carrier beside her, Daniel realized it might be the most valuable thing he owned. First, Sarah said, her fingers flying over the keys with surprising speed. We need to look at the actual code that handles data prioritization. You know how to code? Daniel asked, peering over her shoulder. Basic Python and some database management. You pick things up in nursing school. Medical devices are essentially computers that interface with human biology. She paused, glancing at him. Do you still have access to the secure tech development servers? Daniel's heart sank. No, they revoked all my access when the board voted me out. Sarah was quiet for a moment, then smiled, the first genuinely mischievous expression Daniel had seen from her. What about your personal backup drives? What personal backup drives? Daniel, you strike me as the kind of CEO who would have kept personal copies of everything, just in case. Especially source code for products you personally developed. Daniel stared at her. She was right, of course. He had kept backups, not because he'd planned for corporate espionage, but because he was paranoid about losing work. Those drives were in a safety deposit box across town, along with other personal documents he'd managed to keep away from the creditors. Even if I had the code, he said carefully, we'd need development tools, testing environments, hardware for prototyping. Sarah, we're sitting in an empty house with 20 minutes before eviction. We can't rebuild a product in 20 minutes. We don't need to rebuild anything, Sarah said. We just need to prove the concept works. Show that the fix is viable. Outside, Daniel heard a car door slam. Through the window, he could see a sheriff's deputy walking up the front path, clipboard in hand. The eviction was starting early. Sarah, Daniel said urgently, we're out of time. But Sarah wasn't listening. She was staring at the laptop screen, her eyes moving rapidly as she read through lines of code. Daniel, this is brilliant. The sensor integration, the data processing algorithms, this is really sophisticated work. Thanks, but no, you don't understand. This isn't just good for a baby monitor. This is good enough for hospital-grade medical equipment. The precision, the real-time processing capabilities, you could adapt this for cardiac monitors, respiratory therapy, even surgical applications. The doorbell rang. Daniel looked toward the front door, then back at Sarah, who was still typing furiously. Sarah, the sheriff is here. We need to go. Give me 2 more minutes. We don't have 2 minutes. Then give me 1. Daniel walked to the front door and opened it to find Deputy Martinez, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and an apologetic expression. Mr. Kessler? I'm sorry, but I need to execute this eviction notice. You and any occupants need to vacate the premises immediately. Deputy, I understand, but could you give us just a few more minutes? We're in the middle of something important. Deputy Martinez looked past Daniel into the empty house, where she could see Sarah hunched over a laptop with a baby sleeping beside her. Her expression softened slightly. Sir, I've got my orders. The bank wants this property secured today. I know, but 5 minutes. Please. I think we might be on the verge of something that could change everything. Behind him, Daniel heard Sarah make a sound of triumph. Daniel, I found it. Deputy Martinez raised an eyebrow. Found what? Daniel looked back at Sarah, who was gesturing excitedly at the laptop screen. Sarah, what did you find? The bandwidth bottleneck. Look at this code block. It's trying to process multiple sensor inputs simultaneously instead of prioritizing critical readings. If you modify the algorithm to handle life safety data first, then process supplementary information during idle cycles. She was talking faster now, her excitement building. And look here, the wireless protocol is using standard Wi-Fi instead of a dedicated frequency. No wonder it gets interference from other devices. But if you implement a mesh network approach with frequency hopping, Daniel moved closer to the laptop, studying the code Sarah was pointing to. Even with his limited programming background, he could see what she was talking about. The problems were elegant in their simplicity, not fundamental flaws in the technology, but basic design decisions that hadn't accounted for real-world usage. He started, then stopped. This is fixable. All of it is fixable. Not just fixable, Sarah said. Improvable. Daniel, with these modifications, your monitors wouldn't just work better. They'd be more accurate than anything currently on the market. Deputy Martinez cleared her throat. Folks, I hate to interrupt what sounds like important work, but I really do need to secure this property. Daniel looked at the deputy, then at Sarah, then at the laptop screen filled with code that might represent a second chance for everything he'd lost. Deputy, he said slowly, what if I told you that what we're working on here could save lives? That it could prevent the kind of tragedy that destroyed my company in the first place? I'd say that sounds very important, Deputy Martinez replied. But I'd also say that I still have a job to do. Sarah looked up from the laptop. How long would we need to demonstrate that the fix works? To prove the concept? Maybe an hour if we had the right equipment. To build a working prototype? Daniel thought about it. With proper development tools and hardware access? Maybe a week. And to take it to market? If everything worked perfectly? 6 months. Maybe less. Sarah closed the laptop and stood up, lifting Mateo from his carrier. Then we don't need this house. Daniel stared at her. What? Daniel, you're thinking like someone who's lost everything. But you haven't lost everything. You've lost money, property, reputation. But you haven't lost your knowledge, your experience, or your ability to solve problems. Sarah, even if the fix works, I don't have funding to restart the company. I don't have investors. I don't have credit. I don't have. You have something better, Sarah interrupted. You have a story. A redemption story. A story about a CEO who lost everything, learned from his mistakes, and came back with a solution that could save lives. Deputy Martinez was listening to this exchange with growing interest. "Excuse me," she said, "but are you talking about the baby monitor company? Secure Tech Solutions." Daniel nodded reluctantly. "That's me, former CEO of a failed company. My sister used one of your monitors," the deputy said quietly. "The older version, before the recalls. She said it was the only thing that let her sleep at night after her premature daughter came home from the NICU." Daniel felt something twist in his chest. "I'm glad it helped her. She was devastated when you pulled them from the market. Said she understood why you had to do it, but that she wished there was still something that reliable available for parents like her." Sarah and Daniel exchanged looks. "Deputy," Sarah said carefully, "what would you say if I told you we think we've figured out how to fix the problems that caused the recalls?" "I'd say that would be very good news for a lot of worried parents." Daniel felt something shifting in his mind, a possibility he hadn't considered before. "Sarah, what if we don't try to rebuild the company?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if we approach this differently? What if instead of trying to recreate secure tech, we focus on fixing the specific problem that caused the failures?" Sarah nodded slowly. "Open source the solution. Make it available to any company that wants to implement it. Or license it to existing medical device manufacturers. Let them handle the production and marketing while we focus on the technology." "That could work," Sarah said, her excitement building again. "It would be faster to market, lower risk, and it would ensure the fix gets implemented across the entire industry instead of just one company." Deputy Martinez checked her watch. "Folks, I really do need to secure this property. But," she paused, looking at Daniel and Sarah and the sleeping baby. "There's a Starbucks about 2 blocks from here. They've got Wi-Fi and they're open late. If you need somewhere to work on this, you could continue there." Daniel felt a rush of gratitude toward this woman who was just doing her job, but was also trying to help them find a way forward. "Thank you," he said. "That's very generous." "And," the deputy added quietly, "if this fix really works, if it really could help babies like my niece, well, I'd like to know how it turns out." She handed Daniel her business card. "My email's on there. Keep me posted." Daniel looked at the card, then at Sarah, who was already packing the laptop back into its case. "We will," he promised. As they gathered their few belongings and prepared to leave the empty house that had been Daniel's last tangible connection to his former life, he realized something had fundamentally changed. For months, he'd been focused on what he'd lost, what had been taken from him, what he could never get back. But now, walking out into the evening air with Sarah and Mateo, headed toward an uncertain future with nothing but a laptop and an idea, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in months. He felt hope. 6 months later, Daniel stood in the conference room of MedTech Innovations, watching Sarah present their baby monitor solution to a room full of investors, engineers, and medical device executives. She wore a professional navy blazer that she'd bought with her first consulting paycheck, and her hair was pulled back in a confident ponytail. Mateo, now crawling and babbling, played quietly in a corner with toys provided by the daycare facility MedTech had arranged for the meeting. "The key insight," Sarah was saying, pointing to a diagram on the wall screen, "was understanding that parents don't use baby monitors in isolation. They use them as part of a complex ecosystem of devices, all competing for bandwidth and processing power at the exact moments when reliability is most critical." Daniel watched the faces around the table. Dr. Patricia Chun from Stanford's Medical Device Lab, James Morrison from the FDA's Approval Division, Lisa Thompson representing the consortium of children's hospitals that had agreed to beta test their solution. All of them were leaning forward, engaged, asking the kinds of technical questions that Daniel recognized as genuine interest rather than polite skepticism. "The mesh network approach," Dr. Chin said, "that's elegant. But have you tested it under real-world conditions? With actual families, not just in laboratory settings?" Sarah smiled. "That's actually how we discovered the original problem. We've been beta testing with 50 families over the past 4 months. Parents with premature babies, families with multiple children, households with extensive smart home systems. The reliability rate has been 99.97%, with 0 false negatives." "And the 3 false positives?" James Morrison asked, consulting his notes. "All traced to user error. Parents who hadn't updated the app or who had modified their network settings without following our configuration guidelines. In each case, the system defaulted to maximum sensitivity rather than failing silently." Daniel felt pride swell in his chest as he watched Sarah field technical questions with the kind of expertise that had taken him years to develop. Over the past 6 months, she'd thrown herself into learning not just the technology, but the regulatory requirements, the market dynamics, the business strategy needed to bring their solution to market. He'd noticed, stopped referring to it as his solution. Somewhere along the way, it had become theirs. The question of liability, Lisa Thompson said. If hospitals implement this technology and there's still a failure, who bears responsibility? Daniel stepped forward. We do, he said simply. SecureTech Solutions 2.0 will carry full liability insurance and provide 24/7 technical support for any institution using our protocols. We've learned from our previous mistakes, and we're not going to let cost considerations override safety ever again. Dr. Chen raised an eyebrow. SecureTech Solutions 2.0? We're bringing back the company name, Sarah explained. Not to pretend the original failures didn't happen, but to acknowledge them and demonstrate how we've learned from them. It's also, Daniel added, about accountability. I was the CEO when SecureTech failed the first time. I want my name attached to getting it right this time. After the presentation, as the investors and executives filed out with promises to review the proposal and get back to them within the week, Daniel found himself alone with Sarah and Matteo in the conference room. You were incredible in there, he said. Sarah was packing up her presentation materials, but she paused to smile at him. We were incredible. This only works because we're both here, bringing different perspectives to the same problem. Daniel looked around the conference room, with its polished table and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the San Francisco Bay. It was a long way from that empty house in Queens, a long way from sleeping in his car and wondering how they were going to survive the next day. Do you ever think about that night? He asked. The night I found you and Matteo in the rain? Sarah picked up Matteo, who immediately reached for her hair with his chubby fingers. Every day, she said quietly. Do you think we would have made it without each other? Sarah considered the question seriously. I think we both would have survived, but I don't think either of us would have thrived. Daniel nodded. That felt right. They'd each brought something essential that the other had been missing. Sarah had brought the practical perspective, the real-world understanding of how technology intersected with human needs. Daniel had brought the business experience, the technical knowledge, the industry connections needed to turn insights into action. But more than that, they brought hope to each other when hope had seemed impossible. Sarah, Daniel said carefully, there's something I've been wanting to ask you. She looked at him with the same careful attention she'd given to everything else over the past 6 months. When we get the funding, when SecureTech 2.0 becomes a real company again, I want you to be my co-founder. Not my consultant, not my advisor. My equal partner in this. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, bouncing Matteo gently in her arms. Daniel, I don't have an MBA. I never finished nursing school. I don't have the credentials. You have something better than credentials, Daniel interrupted. You have wisdom. You have the ability to see what's actually important instead of what's theoretically interesting. You have the courage to challenge assumptions and ask the questions that everyone else is afraid to ask. I also have a 10-month-old baby and no childcare and a history of making terrible decisions about men. Daniel laughed. Well, I have a history of making terrible decisions about business partners and a tendency to get so focused on technology that I forget about the humans it's supposed to help. So we're probably a good match. Sarah studied his face, and Daniel wondered what she was looking for. Evidence that he meant it? Signs that this was just gratitude talking? Proof that he wasn't going to disappear the moment success returned to his life? Equal partners, she said finally. Equal partners. Equal equity. Equal decision-making authority. Equal responsibility for success and failure. And if we disagree about something important, Daniel thought about that. Then we keep talking until we find a solution we both can live with. Or we flip a coin, but we stay partners. Sarah smiled, the same real smile that had transformed her face that first morning in his kitchen. Okay, she said. Yes, I'll be your co-founder. As they shook hands, a formal gesture that felt both ridiculous and necessary, Daniel reflected on how much had changed since that night in the rain. He'd started that evening as a man who'd lost everything, who saw only endings and failures and closed doors. He was finishing this chapter as a man who'd found something he hadn't even known he was looking for, not just a business partner, but a family of choice. Because that's what Sarah and Mateo had become over the months of shared struggles and small victories. Not the family he'd planned on, but the family he'd needed. His phone buzzed with a text message, and Daniel glanced at it expecting another update from their lawyer or accountant. Instead, it was from Deputy Martinez, the sheriff's deputy who'd evicted them from the house in Queens. Saw the article about SecureTech 2.0 in the Chronicle. The message read, "My sister wanted me to tell you she's first in line to buy your new monitor when it hits the market. Proud of you both." Daniel showed the message to Sarah, who grinned and immediately started typing a response. "Tell your sister she won't have to buy one," Sarah wrote. "Beta testers get free units for life. It's the least we can do for people who believed in us when we were just two people with a laptop and a crazy idea." As they left the MedTech building and walked toward their car, a sensible Honda that Sarah had insisted on instead of the SUV Daniel had wanted to lease. Daniel realized that the story he'd been telling himself about his life had been completely wrong. He'd thought his story was about rising and falling, about building an empire and watching it crumble, about losing everything and starting over from nothing. But that wasn't his story at all. His story was about learning that success wasn't about what you accumulated, but about what you contributed. It was about discovering that the most important innovations came not from brilliant minds working in isolation, but from different perspectives working together toward a common goal. Most of all, it was about understanding that sometimes you had to lose everything you thought you wanted in order to find what you actually needed. As Sarah strapped Mateo into his car seat and Daniel started the engine, he looked back at the MedTech building where their future was being decided by people in conference rooms and corner offices. But the real decision had already been made 6 months ago, in the rain, by two people who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain by taking care of each other. And that, Daniel realized, was the best business decision he'd ever made. If you made it to the end, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. It truly means the world to us. See you in the next one.